Fascinating topic, and Keith really worked at formulating his question, pulverizing it, working it, beating it, smashing it, pulling it apart, redirecting it, putting it in a meat grinder, seeing what came out. Violence in the courts of the United Church. The male experience. Keith, we're in your hands.
Thank you very much, Jody. I'd like to start with a word of prayer. If we can pray. O Lord, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight and guide us in our relationships with each other, with the church, your body, and with you. We pray in Jesus' name, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A word of Scripture. To any of you who may have experienced hostility in the church, this is one that I've wrestled with. Matthew 5, verses 38-48. And I'm going to read from the Message translation because I want to upset as many people as possible. Here's another old saying that deserves a second look. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Is that going to get us anywhere? Here's what I propose. Don't hit back at all. If someone strikes you, stand there and take it. If someone drags you into court and sews the shirt off your back, gift wrap your best coat and make a present of it. And if someone takes unfair advantage of you, use the occasion to practice the servant life. No more tit-for-tat stuff. Live generously. You're familiar with the old written law, love your friend and its unwritten companion, hate your enemy. I'm challenging that. I'm telling you to love your enemies. Let them bring out the best in you, not the worst. When someone gives you a hard time, respond with the energies of prayer, for then you are working out of your true selves, your God-created selves. This is what God does. He gives his best, the sun to warm and the rain to nourish, to everyone regardless, the good and the bad, the nice and the nasty. If all you do is love the lovable, do you expect a bonus? Anyone can do that. If you simply say hello to those who greet you, do you expect a medal? Any run-of-the-mill sinner does that. In a word, what I'm saying is, grow up. You're kingdom subjects. Now live like it. Live out your God-created identity. Live generously and graciously toward others the way God lives toward you. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. This kind of stuff has really challenged me. It's interesting, when I first got into ministry, or even into the church, from being a person that fell away from the church, and I got into the leadership positions. I was clerk of session, and now I'm a student minister. I was really surprised at how much fighting goes on in church meetings. I was shocked. And at first I thought it was just one individual in one church. And then I thought it was one individual in another church. And then I thought it was two individuals in the next church I was at. And then I find out that when I talk to people, they tell me, everywhere you go, there's going to be a few that are going to make your life miserable. And I thought that was okay because I could deal with that. But then I found myself not too long ago in a church meeting and getting a little frustrated with the way things were going, and I raised my voice and I started to shout. And I banged my fist down on the table. And I told everybody that we're going to grow up now. And of course, people were very upset because that is not how you act. Now, some may not like the word violence when it comes to the idea of church hostility. And in fact, when I was talking to my interviewees, I didn't really want to use the word violence either. That was Jody who pushed me toward using that language. He said it was sexier, that people would be more, he said people would be more likely to come out to a project that had the word violence. But the thing is as I went and talked to my interviewees, it was the right word. The language they used was the language of physical violence. More than once, people said they felt beaten up, really beaten up. They said experiences were very, very traumatic, very destructive. They said their family was attacked. In fact, one person said that somebody told them, "To hell with your family." They said they felt cornered, hit very, very, very hard. And they used terms like, "I was bleeding all over the place. I felt violated, I felt beat up, and I had no way to defend myself." And at times, the participants would slip into first-person language, and at times I felt afraid as I was interviewing them. One of my participants started speaking at me and pointing his finger at me and said, "Just because you're the chair of presbytery, that doesn't give you the power to do what you did. Just because you believe strongly in this, that's not the point. And that doesn't allow you to break the rules. That doesn't allow you to do whatever you want just because you're out to root out this evil in the world." I was scared at times, and I still don't know what to do with the feelings that came up from doing this research project. Along the way, I had quite a few people who, in casual conversation, challenged my choice to use men. Now, the reason why I chose men is because the issue of women and violence is a very complex issue. It's a layered issue. And I'm a man, and I didn't know if that was a layer I wanted to get into. So I thought that I would go just for men, because it was an experience which I probably could identify with more. Although one person said to me, "Do you think that women don't experience violence in the church?" That's not what I feel at all. In fact, I was concerned that the issue of women and violence in the church might be too complex for me to take on. I thought that maybe men would be simpler. And I don't know if that's the truth or not. It certainly wasn't simple. So I chose 4 people. I started out looking for 4 people who had experienced hostility in the church. And I knew of one immediately. And so I was going to interview them. And I started talking to others, and people told me they didn't want to share their story. And so I thought that was interesting. So I decided instead I was just going to pick 3 more random people from around Maritime Conference, and I had interviews in person or by Skype. And what was really interesting is these 3 random men each had stories to share. And so I'd like to introduce you to my 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So I'm going to start with Matthew. Matthew said that when he went into ministry, his life, in his own words, "My heart and soul was church, church, church." However, he had a number of very positive pastoral relationships. He eventually had one that was not going so well. He went into a pastoral relationship where they sought him out. They asked him to come to the church. They said they wanted the particular type of change that he could bring to them. But when he got there, he found out that was not the case. And he even said that before he went, that he felt that was not the case, but they came to him and told him they were ready for it, they wanted it, but it was not the case. And within a year and a half, things had gone very, very bad. People were coming into his office and shouting at him. People were attacking his family and his wife at church meetings. He said more than once, people would come into his office before significant events, such as worship or a funeral once, to start shouting at him, and told him that he had to sit down and listen to what they had to say. And he said that they shouted at him. And he said it got so bad that he didn't know what to do. He said, "I'd wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and my head would be like a gyro. And I'd be just going one morning and I woke and it scared the living daylights out of me because I felt like I was just a hair length away from dropping off. Like if another twig breaks, then I'm in free fall down the ravine. And it was really a wake-up call. And from that point on, I said, it's finished. I'm not going to do anything else. I'm not going to continue with this. If I did, I would probably be in some mental institution." Mark as a story about violence with a colleague. Mark went to an inner city church which was struggling. Attendance was down, and they had just gone back to one minister, one called minister. He built up the congregation, and they got back to the point where they wanted to hire a youth minister. And he was involved in the in getting ready and was agreeable to the person that they called. And here's part of that story, Mark's story. I worked with the church toward calling a ministerial colleague who would be primarily responsible for ministry with youth and young adults. It became very apparent within a few weeks of his arrival that the only way one could have a relationship with him was to be entirely in his fan group. You couldn't have a regular course of discussions such as, you did this and I did this, or how could we have done it better, or anything else than fulsome praise was taken as a personal affront, and anyone who gave less than fulsome praise was quickly identified as an enemy, and enemies had to be destroyed. It escalated to the point where the attacks were also against my children, who were at that point an age where they were in the demographic to which he was to be ministering, and really the whole attempt was to try to poison the younger demographic against me personally. It's not an exaggeration to say he was bent on my destruction. Luke's story is really interesting. I really liked Luke, interviewing Luke. Luke was hard to peg down because I said I picked people randomly. When I called Luke, Luke said, I've never experienced hostility in the church. I have nothing to contribute. And so I tried to set up an interview time, and he had to delay it last second. And I talked to Jody. I said, Jody, I don't think that this guy's worth interviewing. And Jody said, you know what, go interview him anyway. So I did. And what came out of that was really, really interesting. Luke actually had a significant experience of hostility in the church, which caused him to leave ministry for 5 months. And when I pointed out to him that he had said to me that he hadn't had a significant experience, he said, I guess I just forgot. I blocked it out. Luke was taking on an amalgamation in a small rural pastoral charge. And he said there was one man in particular, and he was just fighting for the church to continue, for the United Church presence to continue. But he was to the point where he was pulling people over to the side of the road to get their opinions and to talk to them. Just one of these guys who was passionate to the point where he was scaring people. I would get calls. I was on the road and Mr. X pulled me over to ask me what I thought about the amalgamation, where it should happen, and I was quite afraid. And I was, well, that's quite not right. So in trying to deal with that one, I was kind of at a loss. I was kind of afraid myself. If things didn't go this man's way, what was going to happen? So I left. I left for a couple months away. 4 or 5 months, I think, I was off. John's story was particularly traumatic to me. John was accused of pastoral misconduct. The story that he told was quite benign. Nothing that would make the front page of the newspaper, for sure. But he admitted that he had done something that he probably should not have done. And when he was approached by presbytery about it, he admitted to it. However, the presbytery took very aggressive action to try to end his ministry. He's immediately suspended, forced to resign from all of his committees, and was not allowed to tell his story. He went to presbytery review 3 times. On the 3rd meeting, that's when he was allowed to tell his story. Before that, he was told he was not allowed to speak. It was circulated in the minutes of the presbytery and across the whole church that his name was put on this list for this reason. But when people heard his story, they said, yeah, you're right, that's not really that significant. And then he was allowed to come back. But in the meantime, his life was miserable. He's the only one of the 4 who said, I'm a really good minister. He said, when you talk about hostility in the church, I kind of know what that is. I've experienced it. I've experienced it in my skin, and I watch how people have turned away from me. I certainly did not have a positive view of myself. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to feel. I think lost, naked, vulnerable. I still feel that, but not as bad. I just felt I was entirely on my own and there was no one to help me. No one. The church has a big problem with this because they don't understand proper how to do disciplinary measures. They have no clue or are given no resources. From my point of view, if the church doesn't figure this out, we're going to deal with this kind of stuff. We're going to continue to be hostile toward people in ministry. I think it's just going to get worse. Right now, it's almost impossible for a minister to protect themselves. So those are my 4 evangelists. As I said, 3 chosen randomly. And as you can imagine, I was a little bit distressed that these stories seemed to be quite significant. I was not prepared for the level of violence that these people had experienced. There are a couple of common themes that emerged with the 4 of them. And one was that they really felt that the cause of this hostility was power and control, whether real or imagined. One of them said that they didn't really feel that most people in leadership positions in the church believed that there was a lot of power and control in the church anymore. But there is a minority who do, and they will lash out at not just clergy, but at lay people, at anybody, to make sure that their ideas are heard. Most of them said that people just do it because they can. That it's just the way it is. And some people feel that maybe others have been pushed to a corner, that maybe they've been silenced in their own families, maybe they've been silenced in their own lives, and this is a way that's been effective for them to be heard. Sort of like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. That's what Luke says. That was his own words. The louder you get, the more angry you get. Eventually someone is going to turn and say, all right, what do you want? The thing is about the church is we expect it to be different for some reason. 2 of my participants brought up the idea of parliament. They said, Luke says that we even put them on opposite sides of the room. At a hockey game, we expect a fight to break out, even in some offices. And one of my participants said that often at church meetings they feel like a babysitter. It's condescending, but that was their words. Probably the most disturbing trend was the lack of help in the church to deal with these kind of issues. Mark says, in clergy collegial relations, the United Church lives in some kind of utopia where supposedly everybody is happy and cooperative and we all share the sandbox, but we don't deal with the reality that there are clashes. Mostly they don't want to deal with it. They just wish it would go away. And so if one of you will go away, then that's all good. Nobody ever says that's not the way you should be acting. Essentially, I think we're practical atheists in this, that we proceed as if God does not exist or does not matter or does not care about how we behave. John said about the church, they were not prepared to provide any kind of support for me, and they weren't prepared to listen to my story because my story was irrelevant, and they didn't need to hear my story. They didn't need to hear my story. That's what they told me. From my point of view, the church has been quite willing to. At this point, he pauses. It's a full 10 seconds of silence, which is incredible length of time. And he just goes, to hurt me, to damage me. I would no longer look to the church to support me or help me, to love me or care for me. I don't. That would be the last place I would look. If I needed help, I wouldn't go to the church. I wouldn't even go to my colleagues. In particular, presbytery was a problem for 3 of these men. Matthew said that presbytery was not helpful, presbytery was far more harmful, and certainly offered no help. Presbytery clouded it in such secrecy that no one knew anything, so it was open for speculation. Mark said, and what's interesting about Mark is this is a man who I thought was quite stoic, very strong, and he used the word terrified. I was terrified of getting involved with presbytery. He felt it was easier to leave than to go to the presbytery because he was worried that they would slander him or make it out like he was trying to cause the problem. John, of course, was incredibly hurt by his experience and very, very disillusioned by the church. And he said, presbytery doesn't help you at all from my experience. When that happens, the presbytery will take the point of view of the people who are against you in the church. I needed a lawyer because I could not protect myself. My church was not protecting me. My presbytery was out to get me. And he admitted that that sounded paranoid, but he said that's where he is. All 4 of these men left pastoral relationships because of hostility in the church. In particular, Matthew really disturbed me with what he said about his experience. He said, I would never wish what I had gone through on anyone else because it was very damning. I'm a changed person, and I know that from the whole situation, the stress did a number on me physically, and the innocence with which I came to understand faith has been shattered greatly. And from this vantage point, if I had to do it all over again, I would have never gone into ministry. Never. And I add to that I'm still at the point where I would say if I had the opportunity to leave, I would be gone tomorrow. And Luke, who had never had a situation of hostility in the church, I don't know if I want to be a minister anymore if ministry is about people arguing with one another about buildings. Again, slipping into the first person when he was talking to me. So, where I'm at with this now is that this is obviously something I'm going to continue to face in my ministry. This is something that when we go into ministry, if we choose to go into ministry, we're going to have to be aware is going to happen. It's not a case of if. It's not a case of if. We need to help be more prepared to face it. And the strategies that we're using now are ineffective. And we have lots of documents which deal with this issue, and they all say that the way that we deal with it is wrong, which is to avoid it, to pretend it doesn't exist, to be silent about it, to be scared even, is very ineffective. We have become more interested in protecting the institution than we have at protecting the people that make up the institution. The church is more than willing, it seems, to place on the altar of its own continued existence a sacrifice of anyone who may bring questions of liability into the church. And for good reason, because there have been a lot of people, a lot of clergy who have done a lot of bad things and need to be corrected. But we need to make sure that we hear everybody's story. We don't rush to judgment. The thing is that we need to make sure that we're also prepared, the church is prepared to equip people to do this kind of ministry, to do ministry in these kinds of situations as well. John brought up a really interesting idea that the way that we go about trying to attract ministry personnel is based upon the existence of a church which no longer exists. That church does not exist anymore and should not exist going into the future. And the people that we are calling to ministry should be warned of that. We should be asking people very difficult questions, such as, are you prepared to go into ministry if it means that you're going to feel beaten on? It's not that we shouldn't try to protect each other, but we should be prepared that this is not a job for the faint-hearted. John says we can do away with buildings and do away with the way we traditionally thought for the past 100 years in the church. And once we start doing that, then we start getting more involved. And then we start learning who it is we want to recruit as ministers. Who wants to work in a church like that? Right now, it's nuts. Nobody knows. When you go to interview board, they have no effing idea what questions to ask you. They have no idea even how to judge the answers, you know. Here's the question, here's the answer. Okay, fine, there you go. That's because the church as a whole doesn't know what the hell we're doing. However, I also want to point out that for John, once he told his story, he said everything changed for him. When he had the opportunity for his voice to be heard, everything changed. I want to end with Matthew 18, verses 15 to 19. And I'm going to read from the New International Version. If a brother or sister sins, go and point out the fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of two or three witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as a pagan or a tax collector. I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, I tell you truly, that if two of you on earth agree about anything you ask for, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where two or three come together in my name, there I am with them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith, for your presentation there. There's a kind of thread in theology that's the glorification of suffering. At what point do we call it out? Violence and abuse, at what point do we call it out and say, you can't do that?
I think that we have to call it out as quickly as possible. I think that if we're one of the things that I've learned along this ministry journey is that when I'm feeling threatened, when I'm feeling hurt, that the quicker I can own that and name it, the better off the end solution is going to be. If I say, oh, I'm feeling hurt and threatened, but let's see where this goes, often it just ramps up. That's just talking from personal experience. I think that a lot of the literature says that we need to be upfront about it, we need to be open about it. Cosgrove and Hatfield had a great talk about the hidden systems that make up a church family. And they talk a little bit about, of course, Friedman's family system, the Bowen family systems, and talk about how the church is very complicated that way. And one of the things, of course, it talks about is differentiation, right? So that if somebody's attacking me, I have to look and see who are they really attacking. Now that's good. That's good. A counter question I have for that, and I don't have the answer for, is how many times when my sister or brother sins against me do I have to forgive them?
What does it look like to hold the church accountable for that?
I don't know. It's really not part of my question. I wanted to explore what violence, what hostility in the church looked like. And I've been challenged by a lot of my colleagues to come up with some answer or some sort of hope, and I don't really have a good answer. What I do find is that I have not been told by the church or by the theological institution that this kind of stuff happens. No, I mean, they say it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. Yeah, this happens, there'll be one or two. But the fact that it happens so regularly and is so damaging, I think, is something we've been silent about, or maybe too silent about. I mean, those are really good questions, and I wish I had a clear answer. I think if we had the answer, then kingdom might have come.
Lawrence.
My seatmate, Dr. Dean, has gone, so I need to ask then the theological question. About the origin or the drive that you think, you have mentioned power and influence, power and authority. But on a deeper level or a theological level, what do you believe is at work here that leads both the people who act in hostility and speak in hostility toward others not to act out of their best selves, and also those who are on the receiving end of the behavior not to be able to respond out of their best selves, but instead to engage in various forms of reactive behavior on their own? Where is this coming from? And do you see it? I see it as even more prevalent today in the state the churches are in than it was back when I studied theology from stone tablets, back in the old days, when it was real, but still.
Great question.
Where's it coming from?
See, it's almost like I could have planted that. That was a fantastic question, something I cut out of my presentation a little bit. One of the questions that came up when I was doing my research and with my research consultant was the idea of theology, the theology of evil. And so I actually asked all of my participants about this, about what they thought about the concept of evil. And they were split. Two of them loved it. They were all over it. Yeah, this is evil. This comes from a place of evil. And in fact, Matthew was very interesting because he turned it around on himself. And he said that he could easily imagine himself in the position of all those who had attacked him, believing in something strongly enough that they wouldn't hear others' voices. And then he goes right to, and that's sort of like what caused the Second World War. Like he went right to the Nazi argument. Germany was full of good, educated people, and yet bought into a lie, bought into a violent solution, possibly, or a solution which was looking inward rather than looking outward. I don't know I don't really know history that well, unfortunately. So it's doomed to repeat itself on me. I expected a laugh, but that's okay. But the question, so that was interesting. I tried to bring up that question, but what was interesting is, since it was split on that, what my answer to that would be fear. And I'm not sure from my own research, it seemed like there was a real fear on both sides. So people were lashing out of a fear. And if our churches are closing with this degree of rapidness, and if the world doesn't seem interested in what we're selling anymore, then we start to clamor for whatever we have left. And so I think that there's a real palpable fear that's behind this. And again, a fear that if I stand up for myself, the people are just going to either beat me harder, or if I try to call people out, like what accountability is there even in the church? We're very good at holding ministry personnel accountable, but even at that we're very poor at, because it seems like things can go on and on and on and on, and we find out eventually that it went on with so many people colluding that it happened, that we get scared that the second we start to see something else, we want to crush it because we don't want the same patterns to happen again. Whenever we act out of a place of fear, of course, then the theology gets very messy. What was your second question? I'm sorry.
Do you think this kind of behavior is more prevalent today, given the challenges that all the churches are facing in the state that so many of our structures are in terms of their capacity to function with today's challenges?
I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty new to the church. I was just surprised that it happened as much as it did at all, given the light of the scriptures like Matthew 5:38-48. That there were that many people not just willing to fight, but fight back. And that things would ramp up so quickly in church meetings. The meeting that I talk about where I pounded my fist on the table, two of the men were threatening to step outside into the parking lot. I thought that we were going to have a fist fight. And so my reaction was to get angry, to stop it from happening. And it certainly did stop them from fighting, because then there was a new target. And it's something, of course, that I will continue to. It's a growing edge for me. I always feel like I can do so well, and then all of a sudden you find yourself in the midst of it, and you've said something really, really dumb, and you're like, I still have to work more at it. So what I really liked about I believe Friedman talks about the non-anxious presence. So I mean, this is one of the solutions. What? Steike. That's it. I have Peter Steike here. Steike. How your church family works. Yeah. Talks about the non-anxious presence. That might be a way, but your question is, does it happen more now? I really don't know. I mean, all I know is that there seems to be an awful lot of it. I really was interested to hear what a person who didn't experience church hostility, what they had to say about church hostility. But unfortunately, that person seemed to have experienced it not maybe as presently as the other three, but certainly to the degree where they had left ministry. So, I mean, that was disturbing to me.
Thank you, Keith. I think those narratives are really, really important and were very helpful to hear, although painful, but still quite helpful to bring that out. I'm just wondering, in your research, did you see anybody looking at parallel organizations or situations where there could be some point of comparison to, say, an office, Rotary Club, whatever? I always think, well, the theology must play a role here, but on the other hand, sometimes the church is surprised to see that actually we're just a bunch of human beings, and this is how they get along, or don't. But I mean, is there something particular in the church? Maybe we can see it if we can do some comparing to other situations where violence erupts, and what causes it or how it's handled.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because Matthew says the difference is when we're in this venue. Here we have greater expectations. You look at politics and you say, I expect that from politics. Dog-eat-dog world. Some offices you say, I expect it there. Whereas in the church world, there's a sense that the gospel which we hear Sunday after Sunday, the gospel which we preach, hopefully is one of how we see each other not only as human beings, but as all created from God. And in the very act of creation and the act of being a child of God, there should be a sense of respect and care and decorum. So I think I did ask the question, is it different in the church? And there was a split on that too. Some said, yes, it is different in the church. It's different in the church because the expectations are different. Others said, no, it's the same in the church as it is in other places. So, and even Matthew said yes and no. Like, it happens, we just don't expect it to happen, but it does happen. So, in my own experience, being in workplaces, some of the things that have gone on in churches, even as a third-party observer, if that happened in a workplace, somebody would have been fired. So that's an interesting parallel. So there might be a sense of control because there's the economic control of a workplace, whereas we're selling forgiveness. Not selling; it's a terrible word. But forgiveness, we are all coming to it broken. And so I think that we want this mutual understanding. But the thing about is, what do we do for accountability? That's an excellent question that I asked the questions, but everybody had such one person said, we need to tackle this head on. Another respondent said, we need to be very, very careful not to be too upfront about it. So people were not even in agreement as to the best way to proceed. To answer your question, that the question was asked, and it seems like it is the same, but it's different. The expectations might be the difference.
Thanks, Keith. It's a lot of hard work there. Hard on your heart, too. One of the things maybe you've already thought about, but one of the things I want to encourage you to think about as you go forward with the project is the dynamic of scapegoating. I'm a third-generation clergy and sort of heard a few things along the way. And it's kind of like inheriting a family farm, like you can't get rid of it, But it's sometimes said because people in congregations can't kill each other, they kill their minister. And there's a way in which the animus gets turned towards leadership positions because they're most likely to leave. and they're the easiest target. There's a lot more I could say about that, but it's just something for you to consider, and maybe you'd like to comment on it now.
Well, interesting. I used to work in a bar, and one of the things that would happen when that happened in bars is people fought. Like fist fights would happen, and I mean, I'm might be a fairly stocky guy, but I'm not big and I'm not that strong, and I've never actually been in a fight in my life, like a real fight, and so I mean a physical fight. But whenever I saw two people start to fight, I knew exactly what I had to do. Get in the face of the big guy, because he's not the one who has everything to lose. The little guy's desperate, and he's gonna bite, kick, scratch, whatever he can do to win. So you don't get in the face of the one who's scared, you get in the face of the one who's offended. And that was, or just the bigger guy, the guy who was most likely to do the most damage. Scapegoating, though, it's interesting you say that, because one of the jokes that I said far too often, and I say it often in presence of other clergy, is part of my job is to take the blame. In some ways, I don't know if that's a lie. Like, if people are mad at me, then I don't have to work at them forgiving each other, right? I can, because I'm willing to make the extra visit. I'm willing to go out to the house, and I'm willing to do it again and again and again. But that doesn't allow these people to actually repair their relationship. So I'm actually robbing them of the opportunity to grow in their spirituality when I do that. So I love the idea, and I think that it's worth looking into. One of Matthew in particular talked about clergy killers. And it's a term that he used in passing. And there was a resource which I tried to get my hands on that's about to come out, and it was talking about clergy killers. And but they didn't send me it. I wrote them and said I was doing this project, and said I hoped that they would send me an advance copy, and they didn't get back to me. So. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Keith. And as a woman, I think it was great that your group that you interviewed were all male. I think no matter what group you had used, it would be an interesting piece of work to look at. I was really intrigued with the 3 out of the 4 of your evangelists had serious issue at presbytery level. And as a chair of presbytery, especially, have concerns with that. Not terribly surprised in some ways, but I think we should be deeply concerned about it for our clergy colleagues, because presbytery is just the body of both clergy and lay, but gathered together. And in fact, some of you will remember when the issue of clergy needing to unionize came out some years back. One of the arguments was presbytery acts as that. That is our body of support. Clearly, it dysfunctions at times, especially for the experience of these ones. I was wondering if you had, was the context for the 4, was it widely different in terms of the size of the churches that they served and the presbyteries, or were they rather relatively smaller? I'm just thinking, at a recent triennial visit I did, as the people said, 80% of us are all related to each other. And that number wasn't very different for the presbytery too. So that dynamic, but that's a real dynamic.
That's his. Talking about family systems.
That has a whole lot to say about the isolation of the clergy within that context. Yeah.
One of the clergy in particular, Luke, the one who said that they didn't think that they had experienced church hostility, was in a very isolated pastoral charge. The 2 of them worked in cities, and mostly had worked in cities throughout their ministry. And the other 2, I just have to think for a second. I mean, I don't know actually the history of one of them but is currently working in a fair suburban, and the other would work in a rural currently. So, Yeah, a little bit of variety, but I don't know. I didn't try to make any, but that's actually a really good point, I think. Yeah, I mean, even thinking about my own context. Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that Mark had said was he didn't actually blame presbytery. He was terrified to go to presbytery, but he said that presbyteries aren't equipped to deal with it because they're volunteers. And sort of what Gerald had touched on earlier, that even though these are some clergy, some lay, that people will hold a certain position and then will move on, and sometimes there's not a good legacy training of the next person that comes on. And sometimes there's no issue for an extended period of time, so once an issue comes up, there's not really the support to know what to do with these sort of things. So it's a volunteer position often at presbytery. So even though it is part of our administration call. If you are you're looking there like you're saying it's not.
No, I don't know that we can say, well, there's nobody here. There's nobody here but us chickens.
Yeah, I like that.
Like,
I like that.
We are the ones here. This is it. And we've also and where was the next level, right? Like where was that called a conference level, right? For that help. Like somewhere balls were getting dropped all the time, and the result is, we're losing.
People get hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And damage all around in so many ways.
Yeah.
Good. It's now about 12 minutes to 4, so we've just gone past our time, the time we've allotted for this project today. We're going to thank all three in a second, but I want to say thank you so much to Keith. I did want violence. I did press him on violence. Because I was pretty sure that when he began to talk to people, they would use language like bleed and bloody and punched and hit and kicked and spit at. And this is not something to gloss over, but it's something quite graphic. Let's be honest about the kind of language and the experience that people actually have. They're going to say, well, the hostile, they gave me the cold shoulder the other day. Oh, wouldn't that be so easy? But I felt like my family wasn't safe. I mean, this is at the heart of where we live. So well done for unearthing that. Good job. Excellent.